The gavel was a lie. It was not a gavel. It was a cattle prod, a branding iron, a whip. It was the sound of a thing being declared property. Alara heard it crack through the dusty air of the town square, and a part of her cracked with it. Sold. The broker's voice was slick with the cheap oil he put in his hair. He pointed the handle of the gavel, not at a parcel of land or a head of livestock, but at her. A ripple of laughter, thin and cruel, passed through the assembled crowd. They had come for the foreclosure auction of the Miller place, a piece of theater to break the monotony of their hardscrabble lives. They had gotten more than they bargained for. Her late husband, a man of grand ideas and shallow pockets, had left behind a mountain of debt. His brother, acting as executor, had decided that Alara, like the worn-out furniture and the three-legged mule, was simply another asset to be liquidated. Her contract of indenture, signed in desperation years ago when she was a girl with no family and no prospects, was apparently still valid. She was bound to the Miller land, and whoever bought the debt now owned her service. A strong back and a wide hip, gentleman, the broker had crowed earlier, his words stripping her down in front of her neighbors. She's not a beauty, but she'll work. And she's quiet. The word he used was not sold. It was conveyed. The debt and the woman attached to it, conveyed to the highest bidder. Alara stood on the low platform, the wood rough against the soles of her thin shoes. She felt 1,000 eyes on her, not as a person, but as a curiosity. The fat widow, the Miller burden. She stared straight ahead, at the faded sign of the mercantile across the square, focusing on the peeling paint of the letter M. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She had learned long ago to build a fortress inside herself. It was a cold place, but it was safe. In there, the whispers could not reach her. The jeers sounded distant, like wind through a keyhole. But today, the walls were crumbling. A flash of something hot and unfamiliar surged through her. It was not shame. It was not fear. It was rage, pure, clean, and sharp as a shard of glass. Her head came up. Her gaze swept the crowd, meeting the eyes of Mrs. Gable, who clutched her pearls with a look of theatrical pity. She met the eyes of young Tom, the blacksmith's apprentice, who was smirking. She met the eyes of the broker, who was already turning to the next item on his list. "I am not a mule," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the murmuring. It was a sound few in this town had ever heard from her. The broker stopped. He turned back, a look of annoyance on his face. "What was that?" "I'm not a piece of furniture," Alara said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not a line item in a ledger. My name is Alara, and you will not sell me." A shocked silence fell over the square. This was not part of the show. The broker's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Your contract is legal and binding. Your service is tied to the debt. Now hold your tongue, woman, before the new master decides you're more trouble than you're worth." "Then let him decide that," she shot back. "Let him see that he has bought a hornet's nest, not a honeypot." The defiance felt like a fire in her chest, burning away years of cold ash. For one glorious, terrifying moment, she was not the quiet widow, the sturdy woman who blended into the background. She was a fury. Then the fire sputtered. The reality of her situation crashed back down. She had no money, no family, no place to go. Her defiance was a single match struck in a hurricane. The moment passed. The broker sneered, waved a dismissive hand, and moved on. The crowd's attention shifted. The show was over. She was old news. She was allowed to step down from the platform. She did so with a dignity she did not feel, her legs trembling. She walked away from the auction, away from the prying eyes, her back straight, her head high. She did not look to see who had bought her. It did not matter. A cage was a cage, no matter who held the key. She found refuge in a narrow alley between the mercantile and the assay office. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and refuse. It was a fitting sanctuary. Here, in the shadows, the fortress inside her finally collapsed. A single, rag sob escaped her lips. Then another. She pressed her back against a rough brick wall, slid down until she was sitting in the dirt, and let the tears come. They were not just for the humiliation of the auction. They were for a lifetime of being invisible, of being judged and found wanting. They were for the husband who had seen her only as a convenience, for the town that saw her only as a punchline. They were for the girl she had been, a girl who had once dreamed of things other than survival. Section S section, she cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut. It was a storm that scoured her clean, leaving behind an empty, aching quiet. When the tears finally subsided, only the cold, hard rage remained. It settled deep in her bones, a bedrock of resolve. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her cheek. She looked at her hands, calloused and capable. They had scrubbed floors, mended fences, kneaded dough, and pulled calves. They were strong hands. Her hands. Never again. The vow formed in the silence of her heart. Never again would she trust her fate to another. Never again would she rely on the kindness of man, for she had learned that their kindness was always a transaction, a down payment on a debt she would be expected to repay. She would work. She would serve her time because she had no choice. But her heart, her mind, her soul, those were her own. She would lock them away, and no one would ever be given the key. She would be a fortress of one. She pushed herself to her feet, her joints protesting. The alley was dark now, the sliver of sky between the rooftops turning a bruised purple. She had been here for hours. A figure stood at the mouth of the alley, a silhouette against the fading light. Her heart leaped in her throat. The new master. He had come to collect his property. She braced herself, schooling her features into a mask of blank indifference. She would show him nothing. She would be stone. The man took a step forward into the gloom. He was tall, dressed not in the Sunday best of the town merchants, but in the worn, functional clothes of a working man. A dusty hat was pushed back on his head. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Miller?" His voice was low and quiet, a rumble of gravel. It held no hint of the broker's oily charm or the town's mocking tone. She did not answer. She simply watched him, her eyes narrowed. He seemed to understand her silence. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands in front of him. It was a gesture of respect she had not been shown all day. It put her on guard. "The name is Silas Blackwood," he said. "I run a ranch out past the ridge. The Broken T." So this was him, the man who owned her. She studied him. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. His eyes were deep set, and they looked at her with a steady, assessing gaze. It was not the way a man looked at a woman. It was the way a man looked at a fence that needed mending or a sky that threatened rain. It was practical, unflinching, and strangely, it lacked judgment. "I heard what the broker said," he continued, his voice still quiet. He was wrong. Alara's breath caught. She had expected threats or orders or, at the very least, a reminder of her news station. Not this. "You are not my property," Silas Blackwood said, and the words fell like stones into the quiet alley. "I paid the debt. That's all. The law says your contract is tied to it. The law is an ass." She stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate, treacherous flicker of hope. This was a trick. It had to be. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I need a housekeeper," he said simply. "My place is a disaster. The last one quit 3 months ago. The hands are threatening to mutiny over my cooking." A housekeeper. It was still servitude, but the word was different. It implied a job, not bondage. "I'm offering a position," he went on, as if sensing the turn of her thoughts. "You'll have your own room. It has a lock on the inside. You'll be paid a wage, same as my other hands, and you're free to leave at any time. The debt is my problem, not yours. I just needed to get you out of that square before some other fool bought you." Her mind reeled. A room with a lock. Wages. The freedom to leave. These were concepts so far removed from her reality that she could barely grasp them. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp with distrust. "Why would you do that?" He looked down at his hat, then back at her. "Because my mother was a good woman who had a hard life, and I didn't like the look on that broker's face." It was the simplest of answers, and the most unbelievable. "I don't trust you," she said, the word to shield. "I I don't expect you to, he replied, his gaze unwavering. Trust is earned. All I'm offering is a chance. You can take it, or you can stay here. The choice is yours. He stood there, patient, letting the silence stretch. He did not push. He did not cajole. He simply waited. Alara thought of her vow. Never trust a man. He was a man, but she also, though, of the coming night, cold and long. She had nowhere else to go. To choose the devil you don't know over the one you do. But what if this wasn't a devil at all? What if he was just a man? She took a deep, shuddering breath. The room has a lock, she asked again. And I'll give you the only key, he confirmed. She gave a short, sharp nod. It was the only answer she could manage. A small measure of tension left his shoulders. He put his hat back on. All right, then. My wagon's at the livery. He turned to leave, then paused. He looked back at her, his head tilted. His assessing gaze swept over her. But for the first time, it seemed to soften, to see something more than a problem to be solved. Are you hungry? The question was so simple, so direct, so utterly unexpected that it knocked the air from her lungs. It was not, have you eaten? It was not a statement of fact. It was a question about her immediate physical need. It was a question that saw her not as a contract or a problem, but as a person. All day, she had been a spectacle, an object, a burden. No one had thought to ask if she was hungry. She had not even thought to ask herself. The small, treacherous flicker of hope she had felt earlier roared to life, a painful, brilliant flame in the cold fortress of her heart. She could not speak past the lump in her throat. She could only nod. Wait here, he said. He disappeared from the mouth of the alley. Alara leaned against the wall, her legs suddenly weak. She did not know what to make of this man, Silas Blackwood. He spoke in plain terms. He offered respect where she expected contempt. He asked if she was hungry. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a brown paper parcel that smelled of roasted chicken and fresh bread. He did not hand it to her at the mouth of the alley, in the light. He walked back into the shadows where she stood. He held it out. The eatery was closing. It's not much. She took the parcel. It was still warm. The warmth seeped into her cold hands. Thank you, she whispered. The words felt foreign on her tongue. He simply nodded. Wagons this way. He led her out of the alley and toward the livery stable. He walked a step ahead, not looking back, giving her space. He did not try to make small talk. He did not ask her questions. He simply walked, and she followed. In the dim light of the stable, she saw the wagon. It was like the man, functional, sturdy, and unadorned. A single, patient horse stood in the traces. Silas helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching her elbow. His touch was firm and impersonal, like a blacksmith handling a tool. Then he climbed up beside her, took the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse in motion. As the wagon rumbled out of town, Alara opened the paper parcel on her lap. Inside was half a roasted chicken, a thick slice of buttered bread, and a baked apple. It was a feast. She ate in the growing darkness, the rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds between them. She ate with a hunger that was more than physical. With every bite, she felt a small piece of herself being put back together. Silas Blackwood did not watch her. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. He gave her the dignity of her privacy, even as he sat right next to her. It was the first act of non-transactional kindness she had received in years, and it terrified her more than any threat. Vogue. The journey to the Broken Tea Ranch was long and silent. The moon rose, a silver coin in a black velvet sky, illuminating a landscape of rolling hills and stark, lonely mesas. Alara had lived her whole life within a 10-mile radius of the town, but this was a world she had never seen. It was vast and empty and beautiful. She watched Silas Blackwood as he drove. He was as much a part of the landscape as the rocks and the sagebrush. He was quiet, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the quiet of a man who was listening, who was paying attention. He seemed to be in constant conversation with the world around him. The feel of the air, the sound of the horses breathing, the shape of the shadows on the road. When they finally turned off the main track and onto a rougher road, he spoke for the first time in over an hour. "We're on my land now," he said. She looked out into the darkness. She could not see much, just the endless rolling land under the moonlight. But she could feel a change in the air. This was his place. They crested a low rise, and she saw it. A collection of dark buildings huddled in a shallow valley, a single yellow light glowing in the window of the largest one. The ranch house. As they drew closer, the reality of the place began to emerge from the romantic shadows. The fences were sagging in places. A wagon near the barn was missing a wheel. The whole place had an air of exhaustion, of a long, losing battle against time and gravity. It looked, Alara thought, the way she felt. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the main house. "We're here." He helped her down, then led her up the 3 rickety steps to the porch. He pushed open the door, and a wave of stale, close air washed over them. The single lamp in the main room cast long, dancing shadows. It revealed a scene of profound and masculine disorder. Plates with the fossilized remains of old meals were stacked on a table. Boots, caked with mud, stood in a silent, disorderly parade by the door. A layer of dust covered every surface, thick and soft as felt. The place was not just messy. It was neglected. It was the home of a man who had given up on the small comforts, who was too busy fighting larger battles to worry about the state of his hearth. "I told you it was a disaster," Silas said, a note of weary apology in his voice. Alara said nothing. She took it all in, her practical mind already cataloging, organizing, planning. The windows needed washing. The floor needed scrubbing. The whole house needed to be thrown open to the sun and the wind. This was a language she understood. This was a chaos she knew how to conquer. "Your room is this way," he said, picking up the lamp. He led her down a short hallway to a closed door. He pushed it open and held the lamp high. The room was small and spare, containing only a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small wooden crate for a table, and a single nail on the wall for a closet. But the floor was swept, and the window, though grimy, looked out onto the open land. And it was hers. "It's not much," Silas said again. "It's fine," she said, and she meant it. It was a space of her own, a haven. He set the lamp down on the crate. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned iron key. He placed it in her hand. "The lock is new," he said. "I'm the only one who had a key. Now you are." Her fingers closed around the cool metal. It was heavy. It was real. "I'll be up before dawn," he said, backing out of the room. "The kitchen is yours to command. The hands eat at 6. If you need anything," he trailed off, then just nodded. "Good night, Mrs. Miller." "Alara," she said, the name a quiet assertion. He paused in the doorway. "Alara," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Good night." He pulled the door closed, leaving her alone in the lamplight. She stood for a long moment, just holding the key. Then she walked to the door and slid the bolt home. The solid, metallic click was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. She did not sleep much that night. She lay on the strange bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the wind whispering around the eaves. She was not a prisoner. She was an employee. She had a room with a lock. It was a beginning. She rose before the sun, as was her habit. She let herself out of her room and found the kitchen. It was even worse in the gray pre-dawn light than it had appeared the night before. Greasy pots were piled in the sink. The pantry was a jumble of half-empty sacks and unlabeled tins. She did not hesitate. She rolled up her sleeves, found a bar of lye soap, and began. She worked with a quiet, focused intensity. She scrubbed the sink. She scoured the pots. She cleared the counters. She found flour, salt, and lard, and her hands, acting on instinct, began to mix a batch of biscuits. This was her territory. In the chaos of the world, a clean and orderly kitchen was a small patch of sanity. It was a place where things made sense, where effort produced tangible results. As the sun began to cast long, golden fingers across the valley, the smell of baking biscuits and brewing coffee filled the house, a fragrant challenge to the lingering scent of dust and neglect. She heard boots on the porch, and then the door opened. A man stood there, older than Silas, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and intelligent under the brim of a battered hat. He had a look of permanent skepticism. He sniffed the air. He grunted. It was a sound of profound surprise. He was followed by two younger men, their faces still soft with youth, who stopped dead in the doorway, their eyes wide. "Coffee?" Alara asked, her voice neutral. She gestured with the pot. The old man nodded, shuffled over to the table, and sat down. The two younger men followed his lead, moving with a kind of clumsy reverence, as if they had entered a church. Alara poured them each a mug of coffee. They drank it in silence. Then Silas came in. He stopped in the doorway, just as the others had, and took in the scene. The clean counters, the bubbling coffee pot, the plate of golden-brown biscuits on the table. He looked at Alara. His face was unreadable, but she saw something flicker in his assessing eyes. He walked to the table, picked up a biscuit, and took a bite. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. The entire kitchen held its breath. He swallowed. "Supper was good," he said. It was the highest praise she could have imagined. "Ja." The days settled into a rhythm. Alara rose before the sun, and the kitchen became her kingdom. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, not from conversation, but from observation. She learned that the men came in from the north pasture ravenous, and from the south pasture thirsty. She learned that Jed, the old foreman, had a secret fondness for cinnamon in his oatmeal. She learned that Silas drank his coffee black and strong, and that he often forgot to eat lunch unless a plate was put directly in front of him. She did not just cook. She organized. The pantry was soon a model of efficiency, with labeled shelves and neat rows of jars. The root cellar was cleaned and restocked. She started a small kitchen garden in a patch of sun-drenched earth behind the house. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by a lifetime of ingrained habit and a fierce, unspoken need to prove her worth. Not to them, but to herself. The men treated her with a cautious, growing respect. They started taking their hats off before they came into the house. They wiped their boots. They spoke in lower tones. They had never had a woman in the house who commanded respect simply by her presence, by the quiet competence of her work. Alara remained distant. She was polite, but she was not friendly. She kept her fortress walls high. She was here to do a job, to earn her keep, to save her wages. She was not here to make friends. But the fortress had a crack in it, and his name was Silas Blackwood. He never tried to breach her walls. He respected her silence. He never gave her orders, only made requests. He thanked her for every meal. He treated her not as a housekeeper, but as a valued member of his team, as essential as his foreman or his best horse. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, the rhythm was broken. A shout from the direction of the main well brought her to the door. She saw Silas, Jed, and the two young hands, Billy and Tom, gathered around the big water pump that supplied the trough for the main herd. The pump was silent, and a silent pump meant thirsty cattle. She watched from the porch as they worked. They took the casing off the main gear mechanism. They peered into its greasy guts. They kicked it. They swore at it. Silas, his face grim, tried to turn the big flywheel by hand. It wouldn't budge. Gears seized, Jed grunted, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Same as last time. We'll have to haul it into town, get the blacksmith to look at it." "That'll take 2 days," Silas said, his voice tight with frustration. "The herd can't go 2 days without water in this heat." Alara watched them, a strange feeling stirring in her. She had seen her late husband face similar problems. He would have raged and blamed and then given up. Silas did not rage. He just stared at the broken pump, his jaw set, calculating. She had been watching the pump for days. She had noticed the sound it made was different. A slight wheeze, a hesitation in its rhythm. She had noticed the water pressure at the kitchen sink was lower than it should be. She knew what was wrong. The thought of speaking up terrified her. It was not her place. She was the cook, the housekeeper, the fat widow. What did she know about machinery? But she also looked at Silas's face, at the worry etched around his eyes. This ranch was his life. This problem was a threat to that life. She took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked down the porch steps, and across the dusty yard. The four men looked up as she approached, their faces a mixture of surprise and curiosity. She stopped a few feet away, her heart pounding. She did not look at them. She looked at the pump. "It's not the gear," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Jed straightened up, a skeptical eyebrow raised. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we've been fixing these things for 20 years. And you've been fixing the wrong thing," she said, still not looking at him. She pointed to a smaller pipe that led from the wellhead into the pump mechanism. "The problem isn't the intake valve. It's clogged with sediment. The pump is starving for water, so the piston is running dry and seizing up against the cylinder. The gear is just the last thing to break." Silence. She had expected to be dismissed, to be laughed at, but the silence that followed was different. It was thoughtful. Silas knelt down and looked where she had pointed. He ran his hand along the intake pipe. "The pressure has been low," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "I thought it was the well level dropping." "The well is fine," Alaris said. "You can hear it. There's no echo. But the pump is wheezing. It's gasping for air, not pulling water." She had learned to listen to machinery from her father, a failed inventor who had spent more time tinkering with engines than with his own daughter. It was the one useful thing he had ever taught her. Jed looked from Alara to Silas, his skepticism slowly being replaced by a look of dawning respect. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "How do we fix it?" Silas asked. He was not asking Jed. He was asking her. The question was a key, turning a lock deep inside her. He was seeing past the apron, past the label of housekeeper. He was seeing her mind. "You have to bypass the pump and flush the intake line," she said, her confidence growing. "There should be a clean-out valve at the base of the wellhead. You connect a secondary hose, force water back down the pipe, and it should clear the sediment." Silas stood up. He looked at her, and for the first time, his assessing gaze held a spark of something else. "Oh, Tom, Billy," he said, his voice crisp with renewed purpose. "Get the auxiliary hose from the barn. Jed, find me the big wrench. We're flushing the line." The men jumped into action, their movements energized. Alara stood back, feeling suddenly exposed. She had overstepped. She turned to retreat to the safety of her kitchen. "Alara." Silas's voice stopped her. She turned back. He had walked over to her. He stood in front of her, his expression serious. "Thank you," he said. "I should get back to supper," she mumbled, looking down at her shoes. "In a minute," he said. He waited until she met his eyes. "How did you know that?" "My father. He liked to tinker," she said. "I used to watch him." Silas nodded slowly, his eyes searching her face. "What else can you do?" The question hung in the air between them. It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. It was a question that held the terrifying, thrilling possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. A future where she was seen not for her wide hips or her strong back, but for the sharpness of her mind. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. She just shook her head and fled back to the kitchen, her heart racing. But she could not escape the echo of the question. "What else can you do?" "Vugie." The successful repair of the pump shifted something on the ranch. It was subtle but palpable. The men's respect for her, once cautious, became solid and unquestioning. Jed started asking her opinion on things, not just about the kitchen, but about the mending of a harness or the strange noise the windmill was making. The young hands, Tom and Billy, started treating her with a kind of awed reverence, as if she were a magician. But the biggest change was in Silas. He started talking to her, not just about the weather or the meals, but about the ranch. He would sit at the kitchen table after supper, a mug of coffee in his hands, and he would talk about the price of beef, the threat of drought, the constant, grinding struggle to keep the broken tea afloat. He never asked for advice directly, but he would lay out a problem, turning it over and over in his hands like a worn stone, and he would watch her, waiting. She listened, and because it was her nature, she started to see patterns. One evening, he was staring into the dregs of his coffee, his face etched with a deeper worry than usual. "The bank sent another notice," he said quietly. "I'm behind on the loan payment." "Again?" "The cattle are healthy," she said. "The price is steady. Where's the money going?" He sighed, a sound of deep weariness. Everywhere. Feed costs are up. The bill from a supplier in town was twice what I expected. A new harness breaks every other week. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. I plug one leak and another one springs. He stood up and walked to a dusty roll-top desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. "I'm a rancher, Alara," he said, his voice rough with frustration. "Not an accountant. I look at these numbers, and they just swim in front of my eyes. I know I'm losing money. I just don't know why." He placed the ledger on the table in front of her. It was not a request. It was a plea. "Maybe you can see something I can't," he said. She looked at the book. It was an invitation into the heart of his world, the core of his troubles. It was an act of profound trust. Her vow to herself, the one she had made in that filthy alley, echoed in her mind. Never trust. Never get involved. But looking at Silas's tired, hopeful face, she knew it was a vow she was about to break. "I can look," she said. That night, long after the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with a ledger and a fresh pot of coffee. The flickering lamplight cast her shadow, large and distorted, on the wall behind her. She opened the book. The first few pages were a mess of hurried scribbles and blotchy ink. But as she turned the pages, a story began to emerge. A story of bad luck and bad timing and something more. She worked for 3 nights, cross-referencing invoices, tallying columns, making her own notes on scraps of paper. She lost track of time, lost in the intricate, unforgiving logic of the numbers. The numbers did not lie. On the 4th night, she found it. It was not one big hole in the bucket. It was 100 tiny ones, drilled with deliberate, malicious precision. An invoice from the town supplier for 10 bags of oats, with a small, neat check mark next to it. But the corresponding entry in the delivery log showed only 8 bags had arrived. A bill from a blacksmith for shoeing 10 horses, but the ranch only had 8. Payments for fence wire that was never delivered. Charges for veterinary services for cattle that had been sold months earlier. Each discrepancy was small, easily overlooked, attributable to a clerical error or simple carelessness. But when she laid them all out, a pattern emerged. It was a slow, systematic bleeding designed to drain the ranch dry without raising alarm. And at the bottom of nearly every inflated invoice, every fraudulent bill, was a signature of approval. Not Silas's, but another man's. A man who held a lien on the broken tea, a man Silas had described as a friend, a neighbor who was helping him manage the finances. The name was Sterling. Mr. Richard Sterling. A cold dread washed over her. This was not just bad luck. This was a conspiracy. Someone was deliberately trying to destroy this ranch, to ruin this good, quiet man. She sat back, the enormity of her discovery pressing down on her. She had come here seeking refuge, a quiet place to hide from the world. But the world had followed her. The next afternoon, as if summoned by her discovery, he appeared. A gleaming black buggy, pulled by a pair of perfectly matched gray horses, rolled up to the ranch house. It was a stark, ostentatious contrast to the dusty, functional world of the broken tea. A man stepped down. He was tall and handsome, dressed in a tailored city suit and polished boots. He moved with an air of easy, confident ownership. Alara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a cold knot in her stomach. Silas met him on the porch. He was smiling, his hand outstretched. "Richard, I wasn't expecting you. Just checking in on my investment, old friend," the man said, his voice smooth and charming. He clapped Silas on the shoulder. "And to see if the rumors are true." His eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept past Silas and landed on Alara, who was still standing at the window. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "So this is the new housekeeper," he said, his voice loud enough for her to hear. "I have to say, Silas, I'm surprised. I heard you bought her at a discount. Didn't think you were the type to shop for damaged goods." The words were a physical blow. He knew. He had been at the auction. He had seen her shame, and he was using it as a weapon, a way to put her in her place, to remind her and Silas of what she was. A piece of property. Damaged goods. She saw Silas stiffen. The smile fell from his face. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "Her name is Alara," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And she's my employee. You will show her respect in my house." Sterling just laughed, a dismissive, patronizing sound. Of course. My apologies. No offense intended to the lady." He turned his back on Alara, dismissing her as beneath his notice, and draped a familiar arm around Silas's shoulders, steering him toward the barn. "Now, about that loan payment," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. Alara stood frozen at the window, her hands clenched into fists. The fortress she had so carefully built was under siege. This man, this polished, smiling snake, was the architect of Silas's ruin, and he had just declared war on her. She looked from his retreating back to the ledger book still sitting on her kitchen table. The battle lines had been drawn, and she had just been handed her weapon. Ja! That evening, the air in the kitchen was thick with unspoken tension. Silas was quiet, his mood dark and stormy. He had returned from his walk with Sterling with a new layer of worry etched onto his face. Alara served supper in silence. After the other men had left, she cleared the table, then came and sat down opposite Silas. She placed the ledger book between them. "We need to talk," she said. He looked up, his eyes weary. "If it's about what Richard said, I'm sorry you had to hear that. He could be an ass." "It's not about what he said," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about what he's been doing." She opened the ledger. She had marked pages with slips of paper. She walked him through it, step by meticulous step. She showed him the doctored invoices, the phantom deliveries, the pattern of financial bleed. She laid out the cold, hard arithmetic of his ruin. He listened, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a dawning horror. The man he had trusted, the friend who had offered to help him, had been systematically robbing him blind. When she was finished, he just sat there, staring at the damning evidence, his face pale. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Why?" "Because he wants your land," Alara said simply, "and the water rights that come with it. He's not trying to help you. He's trying to bankrupt you, so he can buy the ranch for pennies on the dollar when the bank forecloses." The truth, stark and ugly, settled in the room. A slow, burning anger began to replace the shock on Silas's face. He slammed his fist on the table, making the ledger jump. "That son of a bitch," he growled. "I'm going to go over there right now and—" "And what?" Alara cut in, her voice sharp. "Confront him? Punch him in his smug face? He'll deny everything. He'll say you're a desperate man making wild accusations. He'll call in his loan. You'll lose the ranch, Silas. That's what he wants." Her words stopped him. He sank back in his chair, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a bleak despair. "So what do I do?" he asked, his voice hollow. "He holds all the cards." Alara leaned forward, her eyes intense. "No, he doesn't. He has a plan. But we know his plan. That's our advantage." Silas looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He had said not you, we fight him, she continued, her voice low and fierce. "Not with fists, but with this." She tapped the ledger. "We gather more proof. We find every discrepancy, every lie. We build a case so strong, so undeniable, that when we finally do confront him, he won't be able to talk his way out of it." She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was a strategist, a general planning a campaign. A slow smile spread across Silas's face. It was the first real smile she had seen from him all day. "All right, General," he said. "What's our first move?" And so, an unlikely alliance was formed in the flickering lamplight of the ranch kitchen. The stoic, principled rancher and the quiet, underestimated widow. They were two very different people, from two very different worlds, but they were united by a common enemy and a common purpose. They began to work in secret. By day, Alara was the housekeeper, and Silas was the rancher. But by night, they were detectives, poring over old records, creating a second, secret set of books that told the true story of the broken tea. Alara's mind, once a liability, a place of too much thinking and too much feeling, became her greatest asset. She had a gift for seeing patterns, for connecting disparate pieces of information. She remembered conversations she had overheard in town, casual remarks made by teamsters and merchants. She pieced it all together, creating a web of evidence that led, inevitably, back to Richard Sterling. But Sterling was not a man to be trifled with. He was a predator, and he had a keen sense of his prey. He must have sensed a change in Silas, a new resolve, a flicker of resistance where there had only been weary acceptance. He began to escalate his attacks. It started with rumors in town. Whispers that the widow Miller had a strange hold over Silas Blackwood, that she was a witch or a harlot who had him wrapped around her little finger. The same people who had mocked her at the auction now looked at her with a mixture of fear and suspicion when she went to town for supplies. Alara ignored them. She had been judged by this town her whole life. Their opinions were meaningless to her. But the rumors stung Silas. He was a man who valued his reputation. He found himself defending her honor to men he had known his whole life. Then the attacks became more direct. A small fire broke out in a disused lined shack at the far end of the property. It was put out quickly, but the message was clear. We can touch you. We can burn you. A section of fence along the north pasture was cut, and a dozen calves went missing. They were found a day later on a neighboring property, but the incident was reported to the sheriff as a case of Blackwood's cattle straying, a sign of his incompetence. Each incident was deniable. Each could be explained away as an accident or bad luck. But Alara and Silas knew better. It was Sterling tightening the screws. The pressure was immense. The ranch, once a haven for Alara, now felt like a fortress under siege. The young hands, Tom and Billy, were nervous. They had heard the rumors. They looked at Alara with confused, wary eyes. One afternoon, she overheard them talking behind the barn. Jed says she's smart, Tom said, but my ma says she's bad luck, that everything started going wrong when she showed up. I don't know, Billy replied. She's always been good to us, but the boss sure does spend a lot of time with her. The words were not meant to be cruel, but they landed like stones in Alara's heart. Bad luck. A curse. It was what she had always feared she was. It was the story she had told herself her whole life. She was the common denominator in a lifetime of misfortune. Her husband's failure, her own public shame, and now Silas's ruin. The old, familiar self-doubt, the deep-seated belief in her own worthlessness came rushing back. She was the problem. She was the reason Sterling was attacking. He had said it himself. She was the damaged goods, the weakness in Silas's defenses. If she left, maybe Sterling would back off. If she was gone, maybe Silas would have a chance. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. The idea of leaving this place, this man, was unbearable. But the idea of being the cause of his downfall was even worse. That night, she made her decision. She packed her few belongings into a small cloth bag. She took the wages she had so carefully saved and tucked them into her dress. She wrote a short note, which she left on the kitchen table. Thank you for your kindness. I can't be the reason you lose everything. She waited until the house was dark and silent. She slipped out of her room and down the hall. She was a ghost, leaving the only home she had ever known. As her hand touched the cool metal of the front doorknob, a shout from outside shattered the night. Fire! Fire in the main barn. Alara's blood ran cold. The door burst open, and Silas ran in, his face wild with alarm, silhouetted against a terrifying orange glow. He was shouting orders to Jed and the boys, who were already running toward the barn with buckets. He saw her then, standing by the door, her bag in her hand, her face a mask of horror. His eyes locked on the bag. Understanding and a deep, terrible hurt dawned on his face. You were leaving, he said, his voice flat. I had to, she stammered. It's my fault. All of this. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, he said, and there was a raw, ragged edge to his voice she had never heard before. He strode over to her, grabbed her by the shoulders. He was not rough, but his grip was iron. Do you have any idea what you are? He asked, his eyes blazing. You are the best thing that has ever happened to this ranch. You are the smartest, bravest woman I have ever met. You took a house of chaos and made it a home. You took a man who was ready to give up, and you gave him a reason to fight. He shook her slightly, as if to shake the truth into her. This is not your fault, he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with emotion. This is Sterling's fault, and we are going to beat him. Together. You and me. Tears were streaming down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were not tears of shame or sorrow. I'm not leaving, she said, her voice a choked whisper. Damn right you're not, he said. A loud crash from the direction of the barn, followed by a scream, broke the moment. It's Billy, Jed yelled from the doorway. The loft collapsed. He's trapped inside. Silas's head snapped up. The tenderness in his eyes was replaced by a look of cold, hard resolve. He looked from the burning barn to Alara, and then back to the fire. The final battle had begun. The fire was not just a fire. It was a calculated act of war. The main hay barn, filled with the winter feed for the entire herd, was an inferno. The flames licked at the night sky, a hungry, roaring beast. But the fire was a diversion. Alara knew it in her bones. Sterling was too clever for a simple act of arson. This was something more. Silas didn't hesitate. He was already shouting orders, organizing a desperate bucket brigade, his mind focused on one thing, the life of his young ranch hand. The well, he yelled. We need more water. Tom, his face pale and streaked with soot, ran back from the pump house. Boss, it's no good. The pump's dead again. And the door's jammed. A cold, sickening realization washed over Alara. This was Sterling's real target. Not the hay, the water, and the man trapped inside the burning barn. He was forcing Silas into an impossible choice. Let the boy burn while you fight the fire that is consuming your livelihood, or abandon the ranch to its fate to save one life. It was a cruel, brilliant trap. But Richard Sterling did not know Silas Blackwood, and he did not know Alara. Without a second's hesitation, Silas abandoned the futile effort to save the barn. Forget the fire, he roared. Give me the axe. We're going in for Billy. He was choosing the life. He was choosing his man over his money. It was a choice that would certainly ruin him financially. And in that moment, Alara knew she would follow this man to the ends of the earth. While Silas and Jed chopped their way through the burning timbers of the barn, Alara ran to the pump house. As Tom had said, the door was jammed solid. Someone had wedged it shut from the outside. She didn't waste time on the door. She ran around to the back, to the small, grimy maintenance window she had noticed during her first week. It was high, but not impossible. She found a stack of old crates, her mind working with a cold, clear precision she had never known she possessed. She climbed, her skirt tearing on a nail, her knuckles scraping against the rough wood of the wall. She squeezed through the narrow opening, dropping into the dark, silent pump house. The problem was immediately obvious. The main drive belt had been cut, and the intake valve, the one she had identified before, was not just clogged. It had been deliberately smashed with a hammer. This was not just sabotage. This was a message for her. He knew that she had fixed it before. He was showing her that he could break anything she could mend. She ignored it. She had no time for his mind games. She found the emergency bypass lever, a feature she had read about in one of her father's old engineering manuals. It would divert water directly from the well to an auxiliary pipe, bypassing the broken pump entirely. It would provide a trickle of water, not a torrent, but it might be enough. It took all her strength, but she pulled the heavy, rusted lever. With a groan of protesting metal, it shifted. She heard the gurgle of water moving through the pipes. She scrambled back out the window and ran to the wellhead, where Tom was standing, looking lost and helpless. The auxiliary pipe, she yelled. Connect the hose to it. He stared at her, uncomprehending. Now, she screamed, and the authority in her voice made him jump. A few minutes later, a pathetic but steady stream of water was arcing from the hose onto the burning barn, not enough to douse the inferno, but enough to wet down the area around the collapsed loft, to give Silas and Jed a few more precious seconds. They emerged from the smoke and flames, carrying a coughing, singed Billy between them. They had saved the boy, but the barn and the winter feed and Silas's future were gone. Tja! The next week was a blur of grim activity. The smoldering remains of the barn were a constant, smoking monument to their loss. The bank sent a man who looked at the destruction, shook his head, and handed Silas a formal notice of foreclosure. A county hearing was scheduled. It was a formality, a public rubber stamping of the inevitable. Richard Sterling, as the primary lien holder, will be given the opportunity to purchase the assets of the Broken T to satisfy the outstanding debt. The hearing was to be held in the town hall, the same building that housed the courtroom, the post office, and the collective memory of the town. The day of the hearing, the room was packed. It seemed the entire county had turned out for the final act of the tragedy. The same faces that had watched Alara's humiliation at the auction were now here to witness Silas's downfall. There was a buzz in the air, a ghoulish, electric curiosity. Richard Sterling was already there, sitting at the front table with his lawyer. He was dressed impeccably, his face a mask of sober, regretful concern. He looked every bit the reluctant victor, the friend forced to do his sad duty. Silas sat at the other table, alone. He looked tired and defeated, but his back was straight. He would face his ruin with dignity. Alara was not at the table. She stood at the back of the room, near the door, a simple cloth bag in her hands. She was invisible, just another woman in the crowd. It was exactly what she wanted. The county commissioner, a pompous man named Henderson, called the hearing to order. He droned on about legal statutes and financial obligations. Sterling's lawyer stood up and made a brief, eloquent statement, painting his client as a pillar of the community, a man who had extended a helping hand to a struggling friend, only to be dragged down with him. It was a masterful performance. The room was filled with murmurs of sympathy for poor Mr. Sterling. Then Henderson turned to Silas. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Silas stood up. He looked out at the crowd, at his neighbors. "I just want to say, I did my best. I'm sorry it wasn't enough." He sat down. The finality of the words hung in the air. "Very well," Henderson said, picking up his gavel. "If there is no further business." "There is." The voice came from the back of the room. It was quiet, but it carried a weight that made every head turn. Alara stepped forward out of the shadows. All eyes were on her. The fat widow, the housekeeper, the bad luck charm. Henderson peered at her over his spectacles. "And who are you, madam?" "My name is Alara Miller," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm the bookkeeper for the Broken T Ranch, and I have evidence to present." A gasp went through the room. Sterling, for the first time, looked unsettled. A flicker of annoyance crossed his perfect features. "This is highly irregular," his lawyer sputtered. "This is a public hearing," Alara countered, walking slowly toward the front of the room. "The public has a right to hear the truth." She looked at Silas. He was staring at her, a look of stunned, dawning hope on his face. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Trust me." She reached the front table and placed her cloth bag on it. From it, she removed not one ledger, but two. Silas's original, and her own secret, corrected version. She also removed a stack of papers. Her meticulously copied invoices. Her notes. Her maps. "For the past 2 years," she began, her voice ringing with a confidence she had never known, "the Broken T Ranch has been the victim of a systematic and deliberate campaign of financial sabotage designed to force it into foreclosure." She laid it all out. She spoke not with passion or emotion, but with the cold, irrefutable logic of numbers. She explained the ghost deliveries, the inflated invoices, the pattern of fraud. She named the suppliers, the dates, the amounts. The room was utterly silent. The townspeople were leaning forward, their faces rapt. This was better than an auction. This was a reckoning. Sterling's lawyer kept jumping up to object, but Alara simply talked over him, her relentless stream of facts washing away his legalistic bluster. Then she came to the fire. "Mr. Sterling has an alibi for the night of the fire," she said, turning to look directly at him. "He was in the next county attending a cattleman's dinner, a fact he has made sure everyone knows." Sterling gave a small, smug nod. He returned to town the next morning. Alara continued, expressing his profound shock and sadness at the news of the fire. She paused, letting the silence build. "The problem is," she said, her voice dropping, "the news of the fire did not reach the next county until noon the next day. The telegraph lines were down because of the storm." She let the implication hang in the air for a beat. So how did Mr. Sterling know to be so shocked and sad when he arrived back in town at 9 in the morning? The room erupted in a wave of murmurs. It was the gotcha moment, the fatal flaw in his story. Sterling's mask of calm finally cracked. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "This is absurd," he bellowed. "Are you going to listen to the ravings of this fat, meddling cow? This piece of used goods that Blackwood picked up at a fire sale?" The words, raw and vicious, echoed in the stunned silence of the room. He had done it. He had shown them who he really was. The polished gentleman was gone, replaced by a cruel, arrogant bully. Every eye in the room that had once looked at Alara with pity or contempt now looked at Sterling with disgust. Alara didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze level. She had won. She turned to the county commissioner. "I also have a sworn statement from a young man named Billy, who says that Mr. Sterling offered him $50 to take care of the pump at the Broken T. And I have this." She pulled one last item from her bag. It was a hammer. "The sheriff will find that the markings on this hammer, found in Mr. Sterling's buggy, are a perfect match for the damage done to the intake valve on the pump." It was over. The case was closed. Henderson, his face pale, banged his gavel. "Sheriff," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "take Mr. Sterling into custody." Gee! The reversal was swift and absolute. As the sheriff led a sputtering, defeated Richard Sterling out of the town hall, the room exploded. It was not laughter this time. It was applause. It started with Jed, the old foreman, who was standing in the back. He started clapping, slow and deliberate, his wrinkled face split by a wide grin. Then Tom and Billy joined in. Then Mrs. Gable, the pearl clutcher, her face a picture of righteous indignation on Alara's behalf. Within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, the sound of their approval a thunderous wave washing over Alara. She stood at the front of the room, momentarily overwhelmed. This sound, this public validation, was so alien to her. It was the exact, perfect opposite of the public shame she had endured in the square. Silas came to her side. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a solid, reassuring presence. But then, as the applause began to die down, he reached out and gently placed his hand on the small of her back. It was a gesture of quiet support, of shared victory. It did not overshadow her moment. It anchored it. They walked out of the town hall together, into the bright afternoon sun. People pressed in on them, slapping Silas on the back, offering words of praise and encouragement to Alara. She was no longer the fat widow or the bad luck charm. She was a hero, the woman who had faced down Richard Sterling and won. She accepted their praise with a quiet, distant grace. It was nice, but it didn't matter. The only opinion that mattered to her was the one of the man walking beside her. They retrieved the wagon and began the long, quiet journey back to the ranch. The silence was different this time. It was not tense or weary. It was comfortable, peaceful. The silence of two people who had been through a war together and had come out the other side. As they crested the final rise and the valley of the Broken T spread out before them, Silas finally spoke. "The name doesn't fit anymore," he said, looking out at the land. "It's not broken." "No," Alara agreed. "It's not." He pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the house. The porch was still rickety. The fences still sagged. But the house itself, under Alara's care, had become a home. Her garden was thriving. The windows were clean. It was a place of order and hope in a wild land. They sat for a long moment, just looking at it. "The bank will be more accommodating now," Silas said. "They'll extend the loan. We can rebuild." He used the word we so naturally now. It was no longer a surprise. It was a fact. He turned to her, his face serious. "I went to the lawyer's office this morning, before the hearing." He reached into his coat, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded it. It was a legal document, a deed. She read the words, but her mind could not comprehend them. It was a deed for half of the Broken T Ranch. Half of the land, the cattle, the brand, transferred to one Alara Miller. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Silas, I can't. It's not a gift," he said, his voice firm, insistent. "Don't you dare call it a gift. It is payment for services rendered. You saved this ranch. You earned this. This is your home, Alara, if you choose it." He held her gaze, his own eyes dark and intense. "I need to be very clear about this," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming softer. "I'm not asking you to marry me. I'm not putting you under any obligation. You are a free woman, and you can walk away from here tomorrow with this deed in your hand and half the value of this ranch in your pocket. No strings attached." He paused, took a breath. "But I'm asking you to stay. Not as my housekeeper, not as my bookkeeper, but as my partner. In every sense of that word. I am asking you to choose to build a life here. With me. The choice." It always came back to the choice. He had offered it to her in that dark alley, and he was offering it to her now. The choice to be more than her past, more than her fears, more than the label the world had tried to put on her. She looked at the deed in her hands. She looked at the house, her home. She looked at this good, quiet, honorable man who saw her not as damaged goods, but as his equal. Her vow, the one she had made to herself in her darkest hour, had been to never trust, to never rely on anyone. It had been a vow of survival. But this was not about survival anymore. This was about living. She carefully folded the deed and handed it back to him. A look of deep, profound disappointment flickered across his face. "I don't want half the ranch, Silas," she said softly. His shoulders slumped. "I see. I want all of it," she continued, a slow smile spreading across her face. "With you." His head snapped up. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face, looking for the joke. There was none. "I'm choosing to stay," she said, her voice full of a certainty that came from the very core of her being. "This is where I belong." A slow, brilliant smile transformed his weathered face, chasing away the last of the shadows. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun set over the valley. The sky was a riot of orange and pink and purple. The air was cool and sweet with the smell of sagebrush. The ranch was quiet. The world was at peace. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder. It felt solid, real. Silas reached over and took her hand. His calloused fingers laced through hers, a perfect fit. It was not a gesture of ownership or passion. It was a quiet promise. A promise of shared sunrises, of long days of hard work, of quiet evenings on a porch. A promise of a home. A promise of a future built together. And for the first time in her life, Alara Miller felt truly, completely, irrevocably whole.